Emmanuel Levinas is an important 20th century French philosopher who's well known for his ethics of alterity. He's a student of Western philosophy and Judaism, and he was deeply impacted by the horrors of World War II. He is most typically associated with the philosophical movement known as phenomenology. Phenomenology tries to give descriptive accounts of our experience of things and the conditions of those experiences. And it tries to do so by attending to things carefully and without prejudice. Levinas is preoccupied with a very specific kind of phenomenon, which he describes as the alterity of the other. This phrase, the alterity of the other, is Levinas's way of describing an encounter with another person in which my experience of that person is not colored by my prejudgments and established ways of making sense of things. It is an experience that is oriented toward and by the other. And it is for this reason that many scholars describe Levinas's phenomenology as an ethical phenomenology. We'll now turn to the philosophical mechanics of Levinas's ethical phenomenology that are most important for Benso's ethics of things. Levinas's ethical phenomenology pivots on two contrasting modes of relating to the other, where the other often refers to other people, what Levinas refers to as totality and infinity. It is these two master concepts, totality and infinity, which deeply inform Benso's ethics in her ethics of things. First, totality. To relate to the other as a totality is to relate to the other on the basis of what can be made known about the other through the application of my general and familiar concepts. Consider some of the classificatory concepts I can apply to you. I can regard you as a woman, a child, or a man, as a friend, a foe, or a stranger, as a member of my family. I can regard you as a member of a certain race, class, gender, sexual identity, professional occupation, etc. Each of these general and familiar conceptual classifications make accessible to me a certain view of you in the form of knowledge about you. Knowledge which I will in turn make use of in my dealings with you. I don't interact with my friends in the same way that I do with strangers. I don't interact with my spouse in the same way that I interact with my coworkers, and on and on. It's probably apparent that this totalizing attitude is one we naturally and implicitly take up in our everyday dealings with the natural and social world. As we go through life, we have various goals, and we develop habits and patterns of relating to others that facilitate our achievement of those goals. In order for these habits and patterns to be effective, in order for them to help me reach my goals, I must have a solid grasp of those with whom I'm dealing. I must know how to get what I want out of them. I must be able to master and control the situation. And to do that, I need to know who the other is. Using this knowledge, I can better anticipate the other's needs, desires, expectations, and patterns of behavior. And I can better determine for myself how to interact with the other so as to best achieve my own ends. For example, right now I'm relating to you as members of the audience. That's why I'm here talking to you and why you're here listening to me. This basic conceptual classification, that you are a member of the audience, is designed to give me access to each of you in the form of a generalized piece of knowledge about you. When I classify one of you as a member of the audience, I'm effectively saying the same thing about a whole bunch of different people. I am subsuming what makes each of you unique under a general category. I'm relating to you on the basis of what I can access through my knowledge about you. I can then try to use this knowledge to gain a certain mastery and control of the situation as I attempt to deliver a decent lecture. For example, I can now better anticipate certain responses and patterns of behavior that I know to be typical of an audience, such as having questions, posing objections, getting bored, and getting distracted. While totalizing thinking certainly has its everyday uses, Levinas worries that when we view the other strictly as a member of one of some grouping, we cover over and even exert a kind of oppressive power over those aspects of people that exceed the cognitive limits of my general and familiar ways of making sense of things. In other words, Levinas thinks that totalizing thinking relates only to the substitutable features of others, and not their alterity. For example, strictly as a member of the audience, any of you can be replaced by another member of the audience, just as I could be replaced as an instructor. The particular cogs might be different, but the course still happens. The wheel keeps on turning. It seems that nothing essential is lost, since everyone is substitutable. But in this scenario, the alterity of each person, that about a person which exceeds my generalized knowledge, is lost from view. All of our utterly unique and individual stories cease to matter. Now, for reasons we've seen, Levinas associates this totalizing manner of thinking with control and mastery. But he also thinks it can amount to forms of domination, oppression, and even violence. For in regarding you in accordance with my perspective on you, I am, in a sense, attempting to deny your freedom by determining your meaning and value exclusively based on my ideas about you and the role you play within my world. Consciously or not, I seek to reduce you to my perspective on you. You are forced to bear the weight of my conceptual gaze. And you may be forced to occupy a role or status that you don't recognize as your own. Any alternative meanings and values that you might harbor become second order, explained away as insignificant deviations, primitivisms, or weaknesses. As Levinas writes in Totality and Infinity, individuals are reduced to being bearers of forces that command them unbeknown to themselves. The meaning of individuals, invisible outside of this totality, is derived from the totality. Levinas's deep worry, informed by his experiences during World War II and the Holocaust, is that this totalizing manner of thinking is predisposed to a tyrannical and totalitarian conception of politics and political governance. Or at the very least, that it makes it easier to justify the sorts of reductive and violent maneuvers perpetrated by various political regimes. First and foremost in Levinas's mind is National Socialism. From the perspective of the Nazi system, all that mattered was that one essentially belonged to a certain category that was associated with inferiority, Jew, Gypsy, and so on. The Nazis attempted to strip every individualizing aspect of their victims' existence, their names, their families, their clothes, their traditions, their occupations. Reduced to an instance of an inferior kind, Nazis therefore attempted to render their victims substitutable and disposable. As the German philosopher Theodor Adorno writes, in the concentration camps, it was no longer an individual who died, but a specimen, a deviation from the concept of their total nullity. Auschwitz confirmed the philosophy of pure identity as death. Turning to a more contemporary, but perhaps no less diabolical example, considering the following thought experiment. Let's suppose that I espouse a political ideal of what it means to be an American, which includes a belief in American exceptionalism and limited government, a pro-capitalist mindset, and a healthy respect for Judeo-Christian values. When I deploy the category American, I am also therefore deploying, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly, this set of values and beliefs. The persons and policies that I view as properly American must therefore fall within the parameters of what these values and beliefs permit. Someone who disavows American exceptionalism, champions government regulation and a socialist mindset, and pushes for a decentering of Judeo-Christian values in the public sphere, may therefore appear to me as deeply un-American. For I'm relating to them exclusively on the basis of my conception of what it means to be an American, and the sorts of meanings and values my conceptualizations bring into view. In my dealings with my political opponent, I therefore neglect to consider everything about that person except his or her views about the nation. We can take this example a step further. Consider that my ideal of what it means to be an American is deeply important to me. It defines a significant piece of my identity. Anything that I perceive to contest my understanding of what it means to be an American will, in turn, be perceived as threatening my sense of self and my existing ways of thinking and acting in the world. I can respond to this feeling of threat in any number of ways. The broadly Levinasian worry is that I will respond by trying to discredit, suppress, or eliminate what I perceive to be threatening. It is easier and more comfortable to rest assured in the certainty of my own view than it is to be challenged and changed by the views of another. In contrast to totality, Levinas describes an infinite relation between self and other, one in which my encounter with the other is unencumbered by any of my prefabricated conceptual determinations that I might seek to apply. In an infinite relation, I relate to what is beyond or exterior to my existing conceptual grasp and capacities. In an infinite relation, you might say, I am unconditionally open to the other's self-showing. The other appears to me from beyond my limited perspective and frames of reference. I encounter that other from beyond any generalized knowings or expectations that I might have. In this infinite relation, there is therefore something about the other that I cannot master and control. This is what Levinas calls a relation with the face of the other, where, oddly enough, the face has nothing to do with the empirical features of an individual's countenance, such as the color of one's skin, eyes, or hair, or the shape of one's nose or jaw. Rather, the face names that aspect of the other whose givenness breaks with all conceptual mediation. The face, in other words, gives itself, but what it gives cannot be represented as concept. And it is in this encounter with the face that we enter into the domain of ethics, in the distinctively Levinasian sense of the term. Levinas's task is to articulate a conception of the self that is capable of freely welcoming the other in this way. As he writes in the preface to Totality and Infinity, this book will present subjectivity as welcoming the other, as hospitality. Hospitality is a particularly important theme in Levinas's work. It serves as the paradigm of an ethical subject, a subject that is attuned and responsive to alterity. For through the practice of a certain kind of radical hospitality, Levinas thinks one can come to develop an infinite or unbounded relation with the other. In other words, on Levinas's telling, the practice of hospitality primes the subject for an experience of the alterity of another person. For when one practices this kind of hospitality, one welcomes the other independently of the deployment of any general or familiar concepts or frames of reference that might condition the encounter in advance. As Levinas writes, hospitality consists in receiving from the other beyond the capacity of the eye, which means to have the idea of infinity. The other comes from the exterior and brings me more than I can contain. Hospitality is the cardinal virtue, we might say, in Levinas's ethical phenomenology, since it is this practice which breaks us out of the sphere of totality and grants us some kind of access to alterity. Levinas's account of hospitality is deeply shaped by his Talmudic writings on Abraham, the patriarch of the monotheistic religions. In fact, Levinas frequently turns to a scene from the book of Genesis, in which Abraham welcomes 3 strangers traveling through the desert into his home. Commenting on this scene, Levinas emphasizes that Abraham welcomes the strangers as strangers. He doesn't demand that the strangers announce themselves in advance. His hospitality is not tailored in light of some knowledge he gains about them. In fact, his hospitality is utterly indifferent to their identities, as it involves a suspension of all determinate judgments or categories that can be used to identify the stranger ahead of time. As the Genesis narrative goes, when Abraham saw the strangers, he ran to them from the opening of his tent and bowed to the ground. For Levinas, the utter openness of Abraham's tent, along with the unassuming eagerness of his greeting, underscores the unconditional nature of his hospitality. And while Abraham embodies a distinctive Jewish way of life, Levinas insists that Abraham's lineage transcends religion, blood, and nation. For Levinas, Abrahamic hospitality provides a normative conception of a mature ethical subject that is attuned to and responsive to alterity. We see the dynamics of totality and infinity at play throughout the Spark Hunter file. Following Levinas, our hero and her maker acknowledge that putting things and people in little boxes and labeling them certainly has its uses.
Dualism is useful. It's an organizing principle of human thought that the world can be divided into two categories that are fundamentally different from each other. It creates order emerging out of chaos. Our understanding seems to need dichotomies to make sense of the world.
But both our hero and her maker recognize that this kind of totalizing thinking cannot exhaust the being of a person or a thing. They recognize that there is something that exceeds the sense-making capacities of our existing ways of categorizing and ordering the world. Our hero often speaks of how her government handlers tended to make her into just another category or object, and would wield her toolness for their own ends. But the roles and ends which had been attributed to her from without did not exhaust her infinite possibilities for being.
Am I to cut myself up, put myself into boxes? I run the simulations on every conceivable idea and application, and still, here I sit, and I don't know how to proceed.
This drive for certainty and mastery is manifest in various ways throughout the story. Our hero often speaks of its allure and often recalls how she had once found such certainty through her government work and the sense of power and purpose it afforded her. While representing the Navy, she describes being aboard a Navy warship.
The Resolute floats, a testament to the power of the male, domination and control. Do not cross me, it screams. You feel power, the possibility of power. How many things can claim that? Very few. I was entranced by the paradox of little me, a childish thrill being aboard this hulking juggernaut.
But at one of the major turning points of the story, our hero eventually learns how to claim her life as her own, rather than letting its value and purpose be reductively determined by her government handlers.
Before, my usefulness was for others to wield, the Navy, the NSA, the company, but now my usefulness was mine. Not yours, mine.
The maker confirms the autonomy of our hero, her freedom to be.
I would never seek that control over you. That's not who I am. I made you an open-ended test to grow, to see if you could cut through the world differently.
As we'll see in the fourth and final lecture, our hero is able to not only freely claim her own thingly being as her own, but she also attunes herself to and honors the infinite ways of being in other people and things. She attunes herself to what she will describe as the face of things. In this way, our hero embodies an ethics which is in important respects deeply Levinasian. However, in Benso's reading, Levinas's ethics remains too tightly tethered to the realm of human persons. With Levinas, the other in question is always a human other. As Benso puts it, there are no things in Levinas. There is no alterity of things. So Levinas may be able to teach us how to welcome human others, but not non-human others, much less inanimate things. But the dynamics of totality and infinity that underlie Levinas's ethics nevertheless form a vital component of Benso's approach to ethics in her Ethics of Things. But Levinas's neglect of things leads Benso in search of an adequate account of things. And for this, she turns to the work of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger in his Phenomenology of Things. This will be the topic of Lecture 3.